where he spawned the Amityville horror franchise, has died, while for 25 years left in prison. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was 23 when he shot his parents, two sisters, and two brothers at their Amityville home, which is on Long Island. During his trial, claimed he heard voices telling him to kill his family. The case inspired a series of books and movies after a family who lived at the home after the murders when the house was haunted. He was 69 years old. His cause of death is not known to police.
After nearly half a century behind bars for the murder of his family, on March 12, 2021, the Sullivan Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in New York State, announced to the media that one of its most infamous inmates had passed away. Ronald DeFeo Jr., who was serving 6 concurrent life sentences, had died. The perpetrator of one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history. In 1974, 6 members of a family were brutally murdered by the eldest son, in a crime that would forever mark the history of Amityville. A quiet community plunged into darkness. Dubbed by the media as the DeFeo Massacre, the killings occurred during the fateful early hours of November 13th, inside the house located at 112 Ocean Avenue, leaving the nation in deep shock. But that was only the beginning of a macabre story. The Amityville house seemed to have been tainted by an evil presence that would torment its future owners. A family claiming to have felt the presence of entities inhabiting their home. A paranormal investigation carried out by the famous Warren couple, who described the house as the most haunted in the country, the closest place to hell they had ever stepped into, an indelible scar on an entire town, and a media phenomenon that turned the event into countless bestsellers and box office hits. With Ronald DeFeo, the only witness to what happened that night at 112 Ocean Avenue, also died, the night when that seed of evil bloomed and a tale, somewhere between truth and hoax, began to be written. But the story of the Amityville house was not dying with him. Because what happened after the murders, which turned the case into one of the most unsettling legends of the 20th century, remained shrouded in a veil of darkness that needed to be lifted. It was time to return to that place, to rewrite the story of what came to be known as the Amityville Horror in search of the truth, to return those ghost stories to where they should have remained all along. In early 1976, rumors began to circulate that in a luxurious South Shore community of Long Island, famous for its expensive homes, safe neighborhoods, and prestigious schools, a family had suddenly abandoned their house less than a month after moving in, leaving all their belongings behind, because of something that was lurking at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York. The story of the Lutz family, spread by word of mouth, fueled the curiosity of the public and the press in that quiet community, and gradually, the entire state of New York, eager to find out what had happened, what or who they were fleeing from. To everyone's surprise, on February 15, 1976, the couple George and Kathleen Lutz, aged 28 and 30, appeared at a press conference in a New York hotel alongside their lawyer William Weber to publicly speak about their experience in the Amityville house. During the conference, they recounted to the journalists the events that, according to their testimony, forced them to flee the house 28 days after moving in. They spoke of strange odors and sudden temperature drops, unexplained noises at night such as banging and whispers, a green slimy substance oozing from the walls and ceiling, shadows and figures appearing and disappearing inside the house. one of their daughters talking to what she described as an imaginary friend shaped like a pig with red eyes, an invisible force that kept them trapped inside the home. And above all, as the climax to a series of events they couldn't explain, George claimed he woke up every night at 3:15 a.m., the exact time when a year earlier the DeFeo massacre had occurred in that very house. The Lutzes insisted they were not superstitious people. In fact, George wasn't even religious, and that despite trying to stay in the house in which they had invested all their life savings, the manifestations grew increasingly intense, until one final night when, terrified by that evil, they decided to leave immediately without looking back. They were convinced that the Amityville house was the lair of a dark entity. The public reaction after the press conference was immediate. The event was covered by several local media outlets, and in the following days, the story spread rapidly beyond New York. The Lutzes' account reached every corner of the country. 112 Ocean Avenue was on everyone's lips, and the Amityville house began to be defined as a haunted place. Apparently uncomfortable with all the attention, the Lutzes disappeared from the public eye, but Laura DeFeo, a 22-year-old journalist, managed to contact them directly. Although hesitant at first, George and Kathleen agreed to speak with her, recounting in private and in much greater detail than at the press conference how those 28 days of terror unfolded. After a meeting that lasted over 5 hours, Laura saw the media potential and wanted to organize a serious investigation to verify whether there was indeed something paranormal in the Amityville house. The Lutzes eventually agreed. New York's Channel 5 would be able to film and broadcast everything exclusively. Aware of what they had on their hands, the network executives contacted the most famous pair of paranormal investigators in the United States. Fascinated by the possibility that the DeFeo massacre had left an imprint on that house, the Warrens, who had already worked on over 3,000 cases, accepted immediately. Ed Warren, a self-proclaimed demonologist and World War II veteran, was convinced that certain places could be possessed by evil entities, and Lorraine Warren, a clairvoyant medium, claimed she could sense paranormal presences and decipher the energy of any place. During the trial following the murder of his family, Ronald DeFeo claimed that a malevolent entity, which played with his mind, forced him to commit the crime. The potential of this investigation was so appealing to the Warrens that, according to Channel 5, they didn't even ask for money, just for gas and tolls. Thus, on February 24, 1976, just 9 days after the press conference that kicked off the media circus, Ed and Lorraine Warren, along with Laura DeFeo and members of the production team, met with George Lutz in front of what had been his home just a month earlier to conduct a preliminary evaluation. He gave them permission to enter but refused to go with them. In his own words, there was nothing in the world that could convince him to set foot in that place again. The Warrens ventured into 112 Ocean Avenue. The house had been empty for over a month, but it was clear that the Lutzes had left in a hurry. A gingerbread house Kathleen had made for the kids during Christmas was still sitting on the dining room table, and dirty dishes were piled up in the sink. According to their testimony, although there was no one else in the house, from the very first moment they could feel they were not alone. Lorraine felt nauseous the entire time and spoke of an unbearable headache when walking through certain areas of the house. Something she had never experienced so intensely in any of the hundreds of investigations under her belt. Ed, who explored the basement, the place where, in his view, demons emerged and hid, eager to stay away from God's light, also felt an overwhelming pressure, as if something or someone were fighting to force him out. Upon returning to the street, the Warrens claimed to have just experienced the most terrifying event of their lives. They were shaken, shocked by what they described as the closest contact they had ever had with the afterlife and the forces of hell. It was a statement that without a doubt benefited them enormously, because Channel 5 wasted no time asking them to organize a seance for which they would, of course, be paid much more than just gas and toll money. that haunted house had just become, almost magically, thanks to a couple of statements from that married couple, a gold mine. On March 6, 1976, a total of 21 people arrived at the Amityville house to film the Warrens' full seance, in which they hoped to contact the entities infesting the house, and later, when the banks opened in the morning, cash their check. At midnight, two mediums who came with the Warrens, and who would also join them at the bank, confirmed Lorraine's worst fears. A dark presence inhabited the house. After that, the couple and the Channel 5 team spent hours investigating the house. But aside from Lorraine speaking about what she felt in the rooms and one of the cameramen experiencing heart palpitations, dawn arrived without any tangible paranormal event. However, the Warrens were convinced that the house was infested with demonic entities that created the nightmare the Lutz family had faced, and that in one way or another it was connected to the DeFeo massacre. They said they couldn't help. They didn't know what to do with what, in front of the media, they described as the most evil house in the United States. What they did know how to do, however, when they saw that the seance had not made the media impact both they and Channel 5's executives had hoped for, was to announce a few days later that they had in their possession a photograph taken that very night and just developed that would shock the world. That night, Gene Campbell, the Warrens' personal photographer who accompanied them on all their investigations, placed an infrared camera with a remote trigger on the second floor to capture any anomalous activity in the house. Upon developing the film, he claimed to have found the most terrifying image he had ever seen. The photograph showed what appeared to be a boy with glowing eyes peeking out from a room by the staircase. Lorraine claimed it was the spirit of John Matthew DeFeo, the youngest of the DeFeo children, who was just 9 years old when he was murdered. Unsurprisingly, the so-called Ghost Boy photograph immediately became a media phenomenon. The Warrens and Channel 5 finally had what they needed. It didn't matter that in the following days, independent journalists pointed out that Campbell, at a time when analog manipulation and photographic effects were already possible, refused to present the original negative of the image, necessary for a more detailed forensic analysis. It also didn't matter that it was pointed out that there had been about 20 people going up and down the stairs all night. In fact, one of the attendees at the seance claimed that the figure in the photo was Paul Bartz, a crew member with a build similar to the figure in the image. There was not a single conclusive piece of evidence proving that the image showed a paranormal phenomenon. The most rational explanation was that it was the figure of a real human being captured on camera, a photographic manipulation, or a combination of both. But it didn't matter. The photograph became a symbol of the Amityville story. An alleged piece of evidence endlessly cited to claim that the house was haunted, and that the ghosts of the DeFeo family would torment anyone who dared to live where they had been murdered. From that moment on, the case was cemented as one of the most famous paranormal stories in American history. The next step for this golden goose was obvious. The public wanted the grand finale, a fictional adaptation of the story. Jay Anson, a 56-year-old writer with experience in horror literature, though never quite a household name, reached out to the Lutz family shortly after the media frenzy sparked by the Warrens, with the intention of writing a book based on their account. Although he wasn't the first to approach them, he was the only one who managed to convince them he was the right person to turn their story into a novel for which he already had a title in mind, The Amityville Horror. To create it, Anson interviewed George and Kathleen Lutz, who walked him through the events they experienced during that month at 112 Ocean Avenue, recording everything to ensure the account would be as thorough as possible. They were about to open the doors of Amityville one last time. With Ronald DeFeo imprisoned for weeks following the brutal murder of his family, the Amityville house witness to the massacre has remained vacant since that fateful night in November of the previous year. After the crime, the house at 112 Ocean Avenue was repossessed by the bank, as the DeFeo relatives could no longer afford to pay the mortgage after the tragedy. The real estate agency in charge of the sale was Robertson Realty, which tried to market the house like any other property, but at a relatively low price for the area to offset the understandable unease and even the superstitions surrounding it. Edith Evans, the real estate agent, showed the house to potential buyers including newlyweds George and Kathleen Lutz. Both had been married before and were eager to start fresh alongside Kathleen's 3 children, 9-year-old Danny, 7-year-old Chris, and 5-year-old Missy. George had worked as an air traffic controller in Boston, but after his grandfather's death, he inherited the family's surveying company, Parry Inc., based in Long Island. Motivated to take charge of the business he now owned, he began searching for a home for his new family after getting married. After visiting several towns on Long Island, Mrs. Evans showed them a beautiful Dutch colonial house built in 1928, furnished with pieces worthy of the upper class in the Amityville community. They fell in love with it instantly. The asking price was $80,000 for a large house in one of the town's most exclusive neighborhoods. There had to be a catch. Surprised they didn't already know, considering the media frenzy around the crime, Evans told them that the DeFeo murders had taken place in that very house. But the Lutzes were not superstitious, especially George, a former Marine, who firmly stated that he wouldn't be intimidated by ghosts from the past. The offer was too good to pass up, and he could already envision being very happy in that house with his new family. Thus, 13 months after the crime, the Amityville house found new owners. The Lutz family purchased the home, keeping almost all the furnishings that the DeFeo relatives had refused to reclaim. The very furniture that had witnessed the murders remained, including the DeFeo children's beds, the ones where they were gunned down in their sleep. They kept everything, something that terrified many of their friends and relatives, who believed the negative energy from that night still lingered in those objects. That the spirits of the DeFeos were still attached to them. At the insistence of a friend, and despite not believing in such stories or even being Catholic, George called a priest, Father Ray Pecoraro, who had previously handled the annulment of his first marriage, to bless the house on the very day they moved in, December 18, 1975. Father Ray went through every room, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers of peace to ward off evil and any demonic forces that might have surfaced the night of the murders. It was a routine task he was used to performing in the community, but according to his account, it took a dark turn when he entered what Kathleen intended to make her sewing room. There, he claimed to have heard an insidious voice that in a chilling whisper told him to get out. Although he didn't share what happened right away, they later understood why after leaving the room he nervously asked what it used to be. George told him it had been Mark and John DeFeo's bedroom, the room where the 2 brothers had been brutally murdered. They also understood why, despite telling them they would be fine, he insisted that no matter what, they should never sleep in that room. Father Ray suspected the room was infested with evil but didn't want to terrify the family, who were hoping for a new beginning. The first few days in the house were promising. Although the children were living with a stepfather they barely knew and had to hear classmates at school telling them they lived in the murder house, the family was happy. George and Kathleen already felt that house was their home. But starting on the 4th day, everything began to change. George started waking up in the middle of the night, again and again, always around 3:15 a.m., the time Ronald DeFeo murdered his family, a detail he swore he had no prior knowledge of. Coincidentally, according to Western Christian tradition, this period between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m. is known as the Devil's Hour, the time when the veil between the spirit world and the physical plane is said to be thinnest. the hour when malevolent entities are most active and able to make contact. Meanwhile, Kathleen began having horrible nightmares, reliving the DeFeo murders over and over. George, worn down by his sleepless nights, started to feel a coldness in his body that no amount of blankets or the fireplace could dispel. According to Kathleen, on the morning of December 22nd, when she entered the sewing room, she encountered something terrifying. In that same room where Father Ray had fled in fear, dozens of flies were swarming, even in the dead of winter, as if there were decomposing bodies they could not see. On the 8th day, Christmas night, George experienced something that left no doubt that something strange was happening in the house. After waking again at 3:15 a.m., he noticed the shed door was open. When he went to check, he found no signs of an intruder. But upon returning to the house and looking up, he saw something moving through Missy's bedroom window. Desperate, he rushed into the room, only to find everything calm. There was no one there. But the next day, December 26th, as she passed by Missy's bedroom door, Kathleen heard her daughter talking to herself. When she entered, she saw the rocking chair in the corner where Missy was staring, moving on its own. Heart pounding, she asked who she was talking to. "My friend Jody," Missy replied. Jody was a pig with red eyes who could sometimes be as small as a teddy bear but could also grow as large as the house. Kathleen's skin crawled at her daughter's words. Jody was manifesting to Missy as a pig, an animal associated with the devil for centuries. Kathleen began to believe that an entity inhabiting the house was trying to find its way into their minds through their youngest daughter, the most vulnerable soul in the family. Desperate, and after discussing what they had both been experiencing, they decided to contact Father Ray to ask him to bless the house again, but he refused to return. That's when they realized he had sensed something, the echoes of the presence that was tormenting them with growing intensity. On the 11th day, behind a bookshelf in the basement, Kathleen discovered what appeared to be a small hidden room with red-painted walls, as if someone had tried to conceal it. A putrid stench emanated from it, and Harry, the Lutzes' dog, refused to go near the space. A few days later, the mysterious green slime incident confirmed their senses weren't deceiving them. On the upstairs hallway floor, they found a gelatinous, sticky, damp green substance that, no matter how many times they cleaned it, reappeared every morning. The nightmares continued, and the 3:15 a.m. awakenings became a constant in George's life. Terrified and sleep-deprived, on January 14, 1976, after 27 days living in the house, they decided to bless it themselves, in what they described as a desperate attempt to rid their home of evil. But far from achieving it, in his exact words, those entities took that audacity as a provocation. They were going to destroy his family, and that very night, once again at 3:15, the harassment reached its peak. George, in a desperate sleep paralysis, heard his stepchildren pleading for help, as if they were being tortured, and saw Kathleen's body levitate in the room, while a hooded figure walked from the foot of the bed to kneel on her chest. The following hours are a blur of terrifying memories for the whole family, to the point that when the sun rose on the morning of January 15th, and after receiving confirmation from Father Ray that it was the wisest decision, they decided to abandon the house. Having survived 28 days of what they described as a living hell, by 4 in the afternoon, they were fleeing from 112 Ocean Avenue. The Amityville house was empty once again. This is the story the Lutz family told writer Jay Anson, who, with all the gathered information, began drafting the book in 1977, turning the interviews with the Lutzes into a detailed and stylistically captivating account of what had supposedly happened in the Amityville house. Anson added drama to the events and described the supernatural phenomena much more vividly, introducing that psychological horror element and shocking scenes that would delight readers. The result was the Amityville Horror, published on September 9, 1977, and presented in bookstores as a true account of the ordeal experienced by the Lutz family. Prentice Hall, the publishing house behind its release, contributed to giving it significant media visibility, paving the way for the novel to become an instant bestseller. Despite many skeptics starting to question the events and the debate over its veracity exploding, the book was already cemented as part of popular culture. Amityville and its alleged paranormal horror had become a mass phenomenon. Following the novel's success, Hollywood immediately showed interest in adapting the story for the big screen, with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer ultimately securing the distribution rights. With a budget of $3 million, Sandor Stern wrote the screenplay, further dramatizing the paranormal events to make them more cinematic and emphasizing the demonic possession. Under the direction of Stuart Rosenberg, the Amityville Horror was released on July 27, 1979, becoming an unprecedented box office phenomenon. While terrifying audiences, it shattered all revenue records. The film had been produced on a $3 million budget and grossed over $86 million, becoming the second highest grossing film of that year and the most successful low-budget independent film in history, a position it would not lose until 1999 to the Blair Witch Project. Within weeks, as often happens with Hollywood hits, George and Kathleen Lutz were catapulted to fame, a fame that understandably attracted criticism. Not only did they themselves admit that the events had been dramatized, but the entire story was based solely and exclusively on the testimony of those two people who, with nothing more than their word, had turned that $80,000 investment into a fortune.
The book and the movie depict all these kind of weird, strange things that happened in the house during those 28 days when you were there. What kind of things, George, happened physically? What were some of the things that happened that scared you?
Well, at first, just moving into the house was fine. It's a lovely house.
Yeah.
And we enjoyed moving in. Within a week, Kathy's hand had been touched by something that we discussed and couldn't explain. It was just something unseen. Within
I mean, this is in the daylight, or was it?
Yes,
It was during the day.
right.
Okay.
We also had hordes of flies that would appear within 2 rooms. And no matter how many times we would kill them, they would reappear.
All right, now flies can be a real problem in this part of the country in the summer,
Sure.
in any house, you know.
But if you have 2 or 3 or 4 within 1 room, that could be commonplace.
And it
But
was
when
the
you're
winter.
talking over 100,
Well, this was the winter.
yes,
And you're talking about how many?
over 100 flies
Over 100
at
flies.
one time. And then you'd go around and kill them. They'd be lying on the floor. You'd come back an hour later and they would be there, more of them.
With the rights to their story in the books and films related to the Amityville case, they earned a generous sum of money. From the percentage of proceeds from the sale of the first book, it is estimated that they received between $200,000 and $300,000. From the original 1979 film, they pocketed another $200,000. Later, in the 1980s and 1990s, with the commercial success of the first film, several sequels and remakes were produced, as well as a series of books related to the case. From each of those works, they continued to receive income derived from the rights to their story. Not counting what they may have earned from dozens of media interviews and conferences just from those rights, it is estimated that George and Kathleen pocketed at least between $2 and $3 million in total, which, adjusted for inflation, would amount today to around $16 million. $16 million in exchange for spending 28 days in a supposedly haunted house. They knew that house had a dark past. They knew people wanted to believe. Their life savings didn't seem like such a risky investment, knowing that everyone who wanted to hear about ghosts would listen to them. The story they left behind within those walls guaranteed them a lifetime of royalties. a tale that knew how to strike a nerve with the collective fear and toy with the house's dark past at will. Everyone profited from that story. But behind that literary and cinematic phenomenon hid a horror that required no paranormal hues. The only ghost that haunted Amityville resided in the mind of a boy who allowed the seed of evil to grow within him. Long before the Lutzes acquired that property, before Amityville became tragically known around the world, the house at 112 Ocean Avenue was inhabited by the DeFeo family, an upper-middle-class Italian-American family. Ronald DeFeo Jr., better known as Big Ronnie, prospered financially thanks to his work at his father-in-law's car dealership, which allowed him to aspire to a better life for his family. Thus, in 1965, he managed to buy a property in Amityville, an upper-middle-class residential neighborhood on Long Island, and finally move out of the small apartment in Brooklyn where they had been living. The 3-story, 5-bedroom house, located next to a canal, was an ideal home for them, but not everything was a fairy tale. His wife Louise had been a young woman with aspirations of becoming a model before marriage, but she ended up leading a secluded life, confined at home, submissive and fearful of her husband. Ronald Sr. was an explosive, aggressive and authoritarian man who imposed strict control over his wife and 5 children, especially the oldest, Ronald Jr., known to everyone as Butch. The relationship with his firstborn was particularly conflictive. Butch was a victim of his father's physical and verbal brutality from a very young age. This left a mark on his emotional development, causing him to develop a temper that grew increasingly problematic as he grew older. He became a troubled, aggressive teenager with behavioral issues. In an attempt to correct him, his parents sent him to a strict Catholic school, but the physical punishments they administered only worsened his resentment toward the world. Escaping from his father's abuse, Butch began using drugs like heroin and LSD in his youth. This perfect storm, whose first whispers began in childhood, with an environment that pushed a child toward the abyss, was counting down toward a place with no return. On November 13, 1974, at 6:30 p.m., Butch DeFeo desperately burst into Henry's bar, a few blocks from his home, claiming he thought someone had shot his parents, and that he needed help. A group of bar patrons, including some of his acquaintances, followed him to the house at 112 Ocean Avenue. When they entered, they found the crime scene in the parents' bedroom, where Butch, in apparent desperation, collapsed on the floor. One of the witnesses called the police, and a unit was dispatched to the scene. The detectives entered the house without finding signs of forced entry, only to encounter a macabre scene. An unprecedented massacre in the history of a town known for the peacefulness of its life. The first body they found was that of Ronald DeFeo Sr., Big Ronnie, 43, lying face down on the bed. Next to him lay the body of his wife, Louise DeFeo, 42, in the same position. Both had been shot dead. Suspecting that this double murder might uncover an even greater tragedy, the officers immediately called for reinforcements. Climbing the stairs, the police opened the next door, a bedroom, and found the bodies of the 2 younger children. Mark DeFeo, 12, and John Matthew DeFeo, 9, were lying in their beds, in the same position as their parents, face down. They too had been shot in the back. Next, sensing what they were about to see, they entered another room and found the bodies of the 2 teenage daughters. Dawn DeFeo, 18, had been shot in the neck, and Allison DeFeo, 13, had been shot in the face. The police could hardly believe what they had seen. 6 members of the same family had been murdered while they slept, with no signs of a struggle or attempts to escape. Butch, 23, was taken out of the house as the officers sealed off the crime scene. He was the only survivor and the only witness, and he insisted that the mafia was responsible, claiming his father was involved with the wrong people. But something didn't add up. There were no signs of forced entry, no theft, no struggle. Mafia-related crimes weren't this gruesome. This had been carried out by someone driven by rage. And as they processed the scene, they began to notice that Butch was too calm, more concerned about his safety than the brutal murder of his family. That sole survivor soon became the prime suspect. A few hours later, near the residence behind the house, they found a Marlin .35 caliber rifle, a caliber that matched the preliminary reports of the injuries. It was evident that it was the murder weapon. With suspicions on the eldest son, they searched Butch's room and discovered a box of ammunition of the same .35 caliber. When the bullets extracted from the victims' bodies matched the serial numbers of that box, and his own blood-stained clothes were found, on the morning of November 16, 1974, after more than 24 hours of interrogation, Butch DeFeo was arrested for the brutal murder of his family. The 23-year-old confessed to killing his parents and siblings in a fit of rage, but without a clear motive. According to his account, he woke up in the middle of the night with the idea that his family needed to die. It made headline news. Media outlets across the country ran with the story of 6 family members being found shot dead in their luxurious Amityville home at the hands of the eldest son. A heinous crime that shocked the town and inaugurated the distorted dark history of 112 Ocean Avenue. The trial of Ronald DeFeo Jr. began on October 14, 1975, at the Suffolk County Courthouse, where he was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder. His defense lawyer, William Weber, the same one who would later appear with the Lutzes at a press conference just 4 months later and would try to obtain the rights to the story, argued that his client had suffered a mental breakdown and could not be treated as a sane person. At Weber's request, despite having said nothing about it in his initial statements, Butch claimed in his confession that what had driven him to kill his family were voices in his head. Whispers that forced him to do it. On the night of November 13, 1974, an entity hiding in the basement gave him the rifle and forced him to murder his parents and siblings. A demon that accompanied him from room to room. When he finished the act, he came out of the trance and, with no memory of what he had just done, went to work as if nothing had happened. It wasn't until he returned home that afternoon that the memories of the crime came back to him. Essentially, Weber and Butch were trying to use the justification of demonic possession as a mitigating factor in the trial. Quickly, this temporary insanity defense was discredited by psychiatrists and the officers who found the scene. DeFeo had acted rationally and with planning. He had bought the Marlin rifle days before the murders. It was a premeditated crime. And the way he executed his parents and siblings in the middle of the night while they were asleep was inconsistent with a complete lack of control. The coldness was more than evident. Meanwhile, the prosecution highlighted that Butch had financial problems due to his drug addiction, and that, rather than being an impulsive act or the result of insanity, he may have killed his family to inherit their fortune and live a life of luxury and peace. Although the defense attempted to have him found not guilty by reason of insanity, the jury rejected that argument. And on December 4, 1975, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive 25-year-to-life terms. He was to spend the rest of his life behind bars. 14 days after that verdict, George and Kathleen Lutz moved into the Amityville house. The place that had been the scene of a heinous crime, where 2 parents and 4 siblings had lost their lives at the hands of their son and brother, was about to become a circus. The memory of that family was to be tarnished with ghost stories. Everything in the name of money, fame, and power seemed justified. The Amityville house was never the lair of a demon. It wasn't the limbo of tormented souls still clinging to those walls. There is no curse. But what will remain forever is the memory of that night. That day when evil did find a path into our world. The path that has always been responsible for everything we have destroyed. The ghosts that live in the deepest corners of the human mind.